I never believed in ghosts, demons, or anything of that sort. I was just a regular cop, doing my job like every other day. My name's Mark Jensen, and I've been with the department for 5 years. But this? This was something I'll never forget. Something that haunts me to this day. It was supposed to be a regular shift. We were called out to a scene at an old, dilapidated house on the outskirts of town, a place where even the local kids dared not go. The address was 254, North 5th Street, an abandoned building, its windows boarded up with decades-old wood. The kind of place you drive by and keep your eyes straight ahead, hoping to make it past without any trouble. But there was trouble. And trouble has a way of finding you, even when you're not looking for it. We arrived just after midnight. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the cracked sidewalk. The call had come in from a terrified neighbor, something about strange noises, banging, and a voice. I wasn't sure what to make of it. The dispatcher seemed overly jumpy, too, but I brushed it off. People get paranoid in the dead of night. I remember pulling up to the curb with my partner, Officer Sarah Fields. She was a seasoned officer, cool-headed, never one to overreact, and she'd been on the force longer than me. We stepped out of the squad car, our boots crunching on the gravel as we approached the house. The air was thick, like the kind of silence you feel in a graveyard. Eerie, unsettling. We approached the front door. It was slightly ajar, creaking with every gust of wind that snuck through the cracks. Sarah knocked once, polite, official. No answer. She pushed the door open a little more. The smell hit us first. It was like something rotten was festering in the walls. That didn't sit right with me. Not at all. But we pressed on. Hello. Police department. Is anyone here? I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper as I entered the dimly lit hallway. No response. I motioned for Sarah to follow me as we carefully moved deeper into the house. We hadn't even gotten past the foyer when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, dragging, like something, or someone, was stumbling across the floor above us. We exchanged glances, both of us wondering if this was going to be a typical case of someone in distress or something worse. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. We both froze, our hands instinctively going to our holsters. The house felt alive now, almost too alive. Every creak of the floorboards beneath us was magnified. There was no wind, no air moving, but the temperature had dropped. My breath came out in a puff of white mist, and my pulse quickened. I was about to call out again when a low voice drifted down from the upper level of the house. I see you. It wasn't a whisper, but it wasn't a shout either. It was just, there. A voice that chilled me to my core. I knew in that moment, this wasn't just some old house. There was something in there with us. Something, waiting. I don't know what possessed me to keep moving forward, but I did. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was my training, but I stepped toward the stairs leading up to the second floor, my flashlight cutting through the dark like a weak thread of light in a sea of black. Mark, this isn't right, Sarah whispered, her voice shaky but steady enough to make me hesitate for a second. We should call this in. Get backup. But I didn't. I couldn't. I don't know why. Something told me that calling for backup would be the last thing I'd ever do. Without saying a word, I started to climb the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The darkness seemed to thicken with every movement, wrapping around me like an unseen hand. The air was colder now, and the smell, it was worse. Like wet decay, the kind of smell you'd imagine in a morgue. At the top of the stairs, there was a narrow hallway leading to several rooms. My flashlight's beam bounced off the peeling wallpaper, the cracked wooden floors, and the warped doors that seemed to stare back at me like gaping mouths. Every instinct told me to turn around, to leave, but I kept moving forward, driven by a sense of duty and the sheer terror of what I might be facing. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore. I didn't hear anything at all. But that voice, just a whisper, came again. "I see you, Mark." My heart skipped. It wasn't just a voice this time. It was my name. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced at Sarah, who looked as pale as a ghost, her hand clutching her sidearm tightly. "Who's there?" I called, trying to sound more confident than I felt. My voice echoed down the dark hallway, swallowed by the silence. Nothing. Then I heard something that shouldn't have been possible. A soft, dragging sound, like fabric scraping against the floor. It was coming from one of the rooms at the far end of the hall. It sounded wrong. Like it wasn't human. I took a step toward the room, my breath tight in my chest. Sarah followed, her footsteps hesitant but resolute. I reached for the door handle and paused. I could feel something on the other side, pressing against it, like it was waiting for me. Every instinct in my body screamed to turn and run, but I gritted my teeth and turned the handle. The door creaked open with a heavy, groaning sound that seemed to resonate through my bones. What I saw made my stomach churn. The room was empty, almost. But it wasn't really empty. The walls were covered in what looked like symbols, scratched into the drywall with something sharp. They were crude, jagged, and twisted. It looked like someone, or something, had been marking its territory, like it was trying to communicate through the scars it left behind. In the center of the room, there was a chair. A wooden chair, its back turned to us. And sitting in the chair, was a man. Or at least, it looked like one. His head was tilted forward, as though he was asleep. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, but his face was too still. Too unnatural. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment I was within arm's reach, the figure in the chair moved. Slowly, deliberately, as if waking from some deep slumber. And when it turned its head to look at me, its eyes were empty. Hollow. Black. And it smiled. It was a grin that didn't belong on a human face. A grin that stretched too wide, its edges cracking like a broken mask. That was when I realized, this wasn't just a person. It wasn't even human anymore. Before I could react, it stood up with unnatural speed, its limbs jerking as if it hadn't used them in years. It was no longer just a man. It was a thing, a creature, with broken, twitching movements, dragging itself toward us like a predator closing in on its prey. "Run!" Sarah shouted, her voice laced with panic. But before we could even take a step, the door slammed shut behind us, trapping us inside. We were alone with it. And we weren't getting out. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at that thing, whatever it was. Time seemed to stretch and bend as my mind struggled to comprehend the nightmare unfolding in front of me. The creature's mouth was still twisted into that grotesque smile, its empty, black eyes locked onto mine like a predator sizing up its prey. But it wasn't just standing there. No, it was moving now, slowly at first, but every step it took felt like the world around me grew heavier. It was dragging itself across the floor, its body bending and jerking in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Every movement was a grotesque mockery of life. I could feel Sarah next to me, her breathing shallow, her grip on her gun trembling. She looked just as scared as I felt, but we both knew we couldn't freeze. We had to move. I pulled my sidearm out of its holster, the cold metal in my hand grounding me for a moment. It wasn't going to stop it, I knew that, but it was the only thing I had. "Sarah," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the creature. "Back to the stairs. We need to get out of here. Now." She nodded, her face pale as she gave me a quick glance. Without a word, we moved toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. My heart sank. The creature's head tilted, almost as if it were amused by our panic. It grinned wider, and in that moment, I realized with horror that it wasn't just hunting us, it was playing with us. To it, we were just toys. It was enjoying the chase. Suddenly, it lunged at us. Its body moved faster than anything human should, its limbs stretching impossibly long, fingers curled into claws. The sound of its bones cracking filled the air like a symphony of terror. I barely had time to react before its hand shot out, grabbing my arm with an iron grip. I screamed and tried to shake it off, but its fingers dug into my flesh like needles, cold and unyielding. The creature pulled me toward it, and I could feel its rancid breath on my face, the stench of death mingling with the stale air. I was done for. I knew it. Then, something in me snapped. I brought my gun up and fired. The shot rang out, echoing in the small room, but it didn't stop the creature. It didn't even flinch. It just kept grinning, its black eyes locked onto mine as if mocking me. I fired again. And again. And again. The creature finally recoiled, its body jerking backward with each shot. It let out a guttural sound, a low, growling noise, as though it were annoyed, but it didn't let go. Instead, it pulled harder, dragging me toward it, and I just knew, that if I didn't break free, I was going to die right there. Sarah! I screamed, my voice desperate. Shoot it. Shoot it now. She was frozen. Her gun was in her hands, but her body wasn't responding. I could see the terror in her eyes as she watched me struggle. She had seen too much. We both had. But she didn't shoot. I looked down at the creature's hand on my arm, its grip tightening. I needed to act fast. In one final, desperate move, I kicked out with my leg, hitting the creature in the chest with all the strength I could muster. It staggered back a step, and in that moment of distraction, I twisted free from its grasp. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted toward the stairs, my feet pounding against the wooden floor. I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me, its dragging, scraping movement growing louder with each passing second. It was closing in. I could feel it. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. By some miracle, I reached the stairs and scrambled down them, my legs burning with the effort, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the bottom, I didn't even hesitate. I ran for the door. It was locked again. The same damn lock that kept us trapped earlier. I grabbed the handle and yanked, harder this time, my fingers slick with sweat. I slammed my shoulder into the door with everything I had. It gave way. The door creaked open, and I stumbled outside, gasping for breath as I felt the cool night air on my face. The weight that had been pressing on me was gone, and for a moment, I thought we were safe. But then, I heard it. The dragging. The footsteps. It was still coming. I turned to Sarah, who had somehow made it down the stairs behind me, her face ashen and wide-eyed. We didn't exchange any words. There was nothing left to say. We ran. And the creature followed. The sound of its footsteps was constant, relentless, like a nightmare that wouldn't end. The creature was right behind us, its movements jagged and erratic, but unnervingly fast. I could hear its breath, ragged and wet, as though it were struggling to hold itself together. But it didn't need to be graceful. It didn't need to be fast. All it needed was us. We hit the front yard, but I didn't stop to look around. There was nothing to look at except the darkness and the suffocating feeling that we weren't alone. I glanced at Sarah, who was running just as hard as I was, but I could see the panic in her eyes. Something had snapped in her. She was no longer just scared, she was terrified. And I couldn't blame her. "Mark, it's not going to stop," she shouted, her voice cracking. "We need to," but she didn't finish. The creature's scream cut through the night air, a noise that shouldn't have come from anything human. It was pure agony, like the sound of skin being torn apart, followed by a terrible, guttural laugh. I spun around to see it, that thing, charging toward us faster than I thought possible. It wasn't dragging its legs anymore. It was sprinting. I didn't think. I just ran, every muscle in my body screaming for me to keep moving. We were heading toward the street now, the nearest source of light, the lampposts along the road, but it didn't seem like there was any way out. Every time I thought we had gained a little distance, I would hear its steps getting closer. Closer. I turned my head just for a second to check on Sarah. She was right behind me, but she wasn't going to last much longer. I could see the fear in her face, the exhaustion in her stride. The street was coming up fast. We were almost there. Almost, and then, out of nowhere, the creature lunged. Its claws raked through the air, narrowly missing Sarah by inches. She let out a shriek, stumbling forward as she barely avoided its grip. She tripped and fell, her body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. "Sarah!" I shouted, skidding to a stop. My chest was heaving, my lungs burning from the exertion. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't be that hero who would get us both killed. I had to get to the street. I had to. The creature roared again, a sound that made my blood freeze. I turned, ready to run toward her, but before I could take a step, the thing was upon me. It grabbed my leg, pulling me down with terrifying strength. I kicked and screamed, trying to break free, but it had me, its fingers digging into my flesh like iron. I fired. Once. Twice. 3 times. Each shot hit, but the creature didn't even flinch. It didn't care. It was pulling me closer, dragging me back toward the yard, its black eyes gleaming with something that wasn't just hunger. It was satisfaction. "Mark!" Sarah's voice rang out as she scrambled to her feet, but there was nothing she could do. In that moment, I knew. I wasn't going to make it. This thing wasn't going to let me go. It had me in its clutches, and it wasn't going to let up. But then, I heard something. A car engine. I twisted my head, still fighting the thing's grip, and saw headlights shining through the trees. A car was coming, and it was coming fast. The hope surged through me like a rush of adrenaline. I shouted as loudly as I could, desperate to get the driver's attention. "Help! Help!" The car screeched to a stop just on the edge of the yard, and the driver slammed on the horn. The creature's head snapped toward the sound. For just a moment, it paused, its black eyes narrowing. And that was enough. I managed to break free, barely, and with everything I had left, I stumbled toward the car, practically crawling on the grass, every step dragging my body along the ground. The driver, a man in his mid-30s with a panicked look on his face, jumped out of the car, eyes wide. "What the hell is that thing?" he gasped, but he didn't waste any time. He grabbed me by the arm and yanked me into the passenger seat, throwing the car into drive. The creature lunged again, but the car was already moving, speeding down the street, leaving it behind. I turned around, heart in my throat, and watched as the thing, that horrible thing, stood at the edge of the yard, staring at us. Its twisted grin was still there, and I swear I saw it smile as the distance between us grew. But I couldn't relax. I didn't know if we were safe. I didn't know if it was really gone. As the car sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still following us. That somehow, we hadn't escaped. That thing, it wasn't done with us yet. And that, my friends, is why I'm telling you this now. Because if I hadn't gotten in that car, if I hadn't been lucky enough to escape, I wouldn't be here to tell you about it. But something tells me, something in my gut, that it's not over. And I don't think I'll ever be free from it. I thought I'd escaped. I really did. The ride to the station was a blur, just the sound of the engine, the road, and my heart thumping violently in my chest. I could barely breathe. I didn't speak. Neither did the man who had stopped to help me. He was just as shaken as I was, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. We didn't exchange names. We didn't need to. The silence was all that was needed to understand the weight of what we had both just seen. That thing, the creature, still haunted my every thought. But as we reached the station, something strange happened. I thought I'd feel relief. I thought I'd be able to breathe easy again. But I didn't. The car stopped, and I looked around. The station's lights blinked eerily in the distance, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. For a moment, I felt like something was off. It was like a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. Something was waiting. I don't know how I knew it, but I could feel it. "You sure you're okay?" The man asked, his voice quieter now, as though he regretted even asking. He was trying to be kind, but his eyes were still wide, filled with the same terror I felt deep inside. "I'll be fine," I said, but my voice sounded hollow. Even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. I couldn't. I got out of the car and walked to the door of the station, my legs stiff, my mind spinning. The creature was gone, at least from sight, but the feeling of its eyes still burned into me. Like it was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I pushed open the door to the station. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. I stepped inside, expecting to hear the usual hum of radios, officers chatting, paperwork rustling. But it was dead silent. No one was there. I blinked. What the hell? This was a 24-hour station. Officers were always around, even if it was late at night. My mind raced, and I turned back toward the door to check the time. The clock on the wall above the desk said it was just after 2 a.m. There should have been someone here. "Hello?" I called out, but the sound of my voice felt off. Like it echoed, empty and unnatural. There was no response. My pulse quickened as I cautiously moved deeper into the station. The hallways were dark, the lights flickering intermittently as I walked past the empty offices. I could feel the weight of something oppressive in the air, a tension that made my skin crawl. Something was wrong. But I couldn't place it. Then, from somewhere deeper in the station, I heard something. A thud. Soft at first, then louder, like something, or someone, was dragging itself across the floor. My blood ran cold. I knew that sound. I turned quickly, nearly knocking over a chair as I rushed down the hallway, my gun in my hand. I could hear the dragging again, closer now. I tried to steady my breath, but it felt like the walls were closing in around me. I reached the back office, the one where the sergeant usually worked late on paperwork. The door was ajar, and I could see the flicker of a dim light inside. I inched forward, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I saw it. There, slumped against the desk, was one of our officers, Officer Dave Matthews, a guy I'd worked with for years. His uniform was torn, his face pale and slack, as if he'd been dead for days. His eyes were wide open, but there was nothing in them. Nothing at all. And there, on the floor beside him, was a trail. A long, dragging trail of blood. It led from his body to the far corner of the office. That's when I saw it. The thing. It was crouched in the corner, its back to me, dragging its broken limbs along the floor as it slowly, painfully, turned to face me. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine. My heart slammed against my ribs. I raised my gun. I knew I had to shoot, but it felt like my hands were frozen. The creature opened its mouth, but instead of a scream, it spoke, its voice so low and twisted that it made my bones ache. "Mark. I told you, I didn't wait. I fired. Once, twice, 3 times. The shots rang out, deafening in the silence. But just like before, it didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to care. I ran. I don't remember how. My feet pounded against the floor as I sprinted back down the hallway, through the front door, and into the parking lot. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I reached the car, the same one that had brought me here. I got in without even thinking and slammed the door shut behind me. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. But as I drove, the image of the creature's face stayed with me, burned into my mind. Its grin. Its hollow, empty eyes. I thought I had escaped it. But now, I'm not so sure. That thing, it's still out there. And I don't think it's ever going to stop until it gets me. It's been days since that night at the station, but the fear hasn't gone away. In fact, it's grown stronger with each passing hour. I've tried to stay calm, tried to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, that my mind had played tricks on me. But the truth is, I can't escape it. That thing, that creature, is still hunting me. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I can feel its presence everywhere I go. At night, I hear its dragging footsteps outside my window. I see its hollow eyes in the reflection of windows, in the shadows that move at the corner of my vision. Every time I close my eyes, I see it smiling, its broken, twisted grin stretched across its face. It's not just following me anymore, it's getting closer. Every day, it feels like it's right behind me, always a step away from reaching me. I can't sleep, I can't think, I can barely function. Every time I leave my house, I feel its gaze on me, watching, waiting for the moment when I'm too weak to fight back. I don't know how much longer I can take this. Last night, I did something I never thought I would, something that terrified me more than anything else I've ever done. I went back to that house. It was an impulsive decision, born from desperation. I thought that maybe if I confronted it, if I found out what it wanted, it would stop. I thought I could put an end to this nightmare before it consumed me. The house, that cursed place on North 5th Street, still stood there, decaying and abandoned, just like I remembered. But it was different this time. It felt alive. The air was thick with a malevolent energy that crawled under my skin, making my blood run cold. I walked up to the door, trembling but determined, and pushed it open. The smell hit me first. The same rancid stench of rot and decay, stronger now, as though something inside had been festering for much longer than I cared to know. I moved through the house carefully, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. I felt it again, the cold, suffocating pressure that I couldn't escape. And then I heard it, the dragging sound. It was behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. Just silence. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I crept deeper into the house, following the noise, my gun drawn, my pulse racing. I knew I was getting closer. I could hear it now, closer than ever, the scrape of something dragging across the floor. And then, from the darkness, I saw it. The creature. It was crouched in the far corner of the room, its back hunched, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles. Its head tilted up slowly, and those black, hollow eyes locked onto mine. That grin, it was wider this time, almost stretching too far, the edges of its mouth cracked open like a broken doll. It stood up in one smooth, jerky motion, its limbs jerking and twitching as it moved toward me. My gun was shaking in my hand, but I didn't hesitate. I fired. The shot echoed through the room, but the creature didn't flinch. It didn't even move. It laughed, a low, wet, guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. And then, it spoke again, that same twisted voice that had followed me all this time. "You can't escape, Mark. I'm already inside you." I didn't understand. I didn't know what it meant. But in that moment, something clicked in my mind. Something I had been refusing to acknowledge. This wasn't just a creature. It wasn't some random monster that happened to cross my path. It was part of me. The blood in my veins went cold. This thing, it was hunting me, but it was also inside me. It was feeding on my fear, my terror, my desperation. It had been here all along, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for me to finally acknowledge it. I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every fiber of my being was screaming for me to escape, to get as far away from it as I could. I didn't even know where I was going, but I ran. Through the house, down the hallway, out the door, and into the night. I don't know how far I ran or how much time passed, but eventually, I collapsed in the middle of the street, gasping for air, my heart racing. My body was shaking, my mind spinning. It was over. It had to be. But as I looked up, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The creature was standing there, just across the street, watching me. Its hollow eyes were locked on mine, and that grin, it was wider than ever. It wasn't over. And I knew, deep down, it was never going to be over. It was still hunting me. It had always been hunting me. And as long as I was alive, it would never stop. I've been running for days. Running, that's all I've done. Running from that thing, from the nightmare that has consumed my life. But now, I know something I didn't before, there is no matter how far I go, no matter how fast I run, it's always going to be there, waiting for me. I don't know how I've lasted this long. I don't know how I'm still alive, but I'm running out of options. The police are no help. No one believes me. I've tried to tell them about it, but they think I'm crazy, that I'm just traumatized by something I can't explain. They don't see it, don't hear it the way I do. They don't feel the cold breath on their neck or see the shadows moving at the corner of their vision. But I do. Every second. It's always with me. I've made a plan. I don't know if it will work, but I have no choice now. Tonight, I'm going back to the house. That damn house. The one where it all started. The place where it found me. I've figured it out. That thing, whatever it is, feeds on fear. It feeds on the chaos in your mind. It's not a ghost or a monster in the traditional sense. It's something older, something darker. A thing that exists in the cracks of your mind, in the fear that we try to suppress. It lives in that darkness. And I'm going to fight it. I have no other choice. If I don't, it will never stop. It will follow me to the ends of the earth, and eventually, I'll break. So tonight, I'm going to finish this. I drove out to North 5th Street in the middle of the night. The streets were empty, the world silent. The house still stood there, looming in the distance, its windows like eyes watching me. The moonlight shone on the crumbling structure, and for a moment, I could almost see the shadows moving in the windows, the faint outlines of the creature inside. I grabbed the old fire extinguisher I brought with me, one I'd been carrying for the last few days, unsure of why I even had it, and headed toward the front door. It was ajar again, just like before. The smell was still there, thick and cloying. It hit me the moment I stepped inside, and I felt the coldness creep over my skin. The same sickening feeling. But I pushed it down. I had to be strong. For once, I had to face it. I moved through the house, following the same path I had taken before. The air was heavy. The house was silent, but I could feel it. I could feel the weight of its presence, lurking just beyond my sight. When I reached the room where I had first encountered the creature, I found something different. The walls were covered in fresh markings, the symbols etched deeper than before, the air thick with the same oppressive energy. And there, in the center of the room, was the chair. And the creature. It was waiting for me. Its head was tilted back in that unnatural angle, its hollow eyes fixed on me as it stood in the center of the room. That grin. The grin that stretched too far, too wide. It was still there, as if it had been waiting for me to return. I didn't hesitate. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest, and I aimed the fire extinguisher at the creature. I didn't have a weapon, not really. But I had something that could make it flinch. Something that could blind it, something that would at least give me a fighting chance. I pressed the lever. The foam shot out, covering the creature. For a moment, nothing happened. The creature's grin didn't falter, its black eyes never left mine. But then, it twitched. It staggered back, the foam smothering it, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw it falter. It was afraid. It was hurt. That was when I realized the truth. This thing wasn't invincible. It was just like any other creature. It could be wounded. It could be stopped. I moved quickly, grabbing a nearby broken pipe from the floor and raising it over my head. The creature was struggling now, its body jerking, as though it was trying to recover. I swung the pipe down with everything I had, smashing it into its face. For a moment, I thought it had worked. The creature crumpled to the floor, its twisted body collapsing under the force. Its grin melted into something darker, more desperate. But before I could land another blow, it screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It wasn't even a scream that came from a creature with a mouth. It was a sound that tore through the air like something ancient, something evil. And in that moment, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. It wasn't dead. It wasn't even close. The creature's limbs stretched out like vines, crawling toward me with unnatural speed. Its face, its smile, was back, wider than ever. It was more powerful than I had ever realized. But I wasn't going to let it win. I couldn't. With one last surge of strength, I ran. I didn't care what happened next. I just ran. Out of the room, down the stairs, and into the night. I could hear the creature behind me. Its footsteps. Its breathing. But this time, I didn't stop. I didn't hesitate. I ran until my legs gave out, and when I finally stopped, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. And that's when I realized. I didn't have to outrun the creature anymore. It wasn't about running anymore. It was about surviving. It was about living. And as long as I did that, it couldn't win. But I know one thing for sure, it's not over. It will never be over. Because now, I understand. The creature doesn't just want to kill me. It wants me to become it. And I'll be damned if I let that happen.